Welcome to the latest BuffZone podcast. I'm Brian Howell, and pleased to be joined once again by my colleague Pat Rooney. And Pat, how you doing on this football bye week?
Doing well, sir. Happy Halloween. I see you're in a festive mood there with the hat.
Yeah, nice little pumpkin hat, and happy Halloween to you. And I know you're going to go trick or treating with your kids tonight. Mine are a little too old for that. They'll probably still go because they're in high school and that's what they do. But I'm not going with them. So we're going to talk mainly about basketball. This is our basketball podcast that we mentioned last week. We said it would be basketball only, but we're actually going to just do one this week. We're going to talk briefly about football. And then move on to basketball. But let's just get thoughts real quick on football before we talk about basketball. Um, Football, we haven't talked, Pat, since they became bowl eligible on Saturday and beat Cincinnati 34-23. Bowl eligible for the first time since Halloween in a long time. And so very exciting for the Buffs, and they can just kind of play for the icing on the cake in November, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the encouraging thing for Buffs fans has to be really thorough win at home against Cincinnati. Certainly the best they've played at home in some time. They've had some really good road performances so far this year, but it was good to see that at Folsom Field. And unlike last year, what's been encouraging about this team is the way they've gotten better every week.
Yeah.
This stage of the year, going into November, they're a team that's getting better. Last year it was a team that was kind of unraveling and trying to hold it together, and they played well in the last game, but wound up kind of spiraling as the season went on. But this year, we've seen them. We've watched them get better defensively, get better against the run along the way. We've seen them get better in the pass rush along the way. Offensively, same deal. We've seen the run game come along as the season's progressed. Now we're starting to see maybe the pass protection is starting to really turn a corner and starting to give Shedeur Sanders a little more time to operate back there. So, really encouraging if you're a Bucs fan. This team seems to be playing better. It's a testament to head coach Deion Sanders and the
Mhm.
staff he's put together this year around. The buttons. I even wrote about in the three extra points this week. The rotating linemen. Obviously, it's not a conventional plan, but with this group, it really seems to be working. The competition has maybe kind of clicked in with these guys, and it's kind of an example of the way the right buttons are getting pushed with this group.
Yeah, no question. And this is really only in all my years covering CU football, the second time I've covered a pretty good football team. 2020, they went to a bowl game and they it was a fun little run, although exhausting with COVID. And I don't know how much of that was real, but 2016 was the best team I've covered. And I'm writing something on the defense today about all these numbers defensively. It's like, well, that's the best they've been since 2016, or
Yeah.
the only time in the last 20 years that they've ever done this is 2016. So they're doing a lot of things like that offensively. They're going about it very differently than 2016 in a lot of ways. But the similarity for me, Pat, and we were both around then, is that what you talked about. This team is getting better, and I thought that 2016 team got better and grew with confidence as that season went along, and I'm seeing it with this team as well. And so it's going to make for a fun November as the Buffs hopefully play for a Big 12 title. They need some people to lose because they don't control their destiny, so to speak, sitting behind undefeated BYU and Iowa State, who they don't play. But November is going to be fun.
Yeah, and then also being right alongside Kansas State, who they lost to. So
Yeah.
kind
Mhm.
of three teams that they have to jump ahead, to get into that Big 12 playoff picture. Certainly not out of question, and Big 12 championship game picture, I should say. But certainly not out of question. They'll need a little help, but
Mhm.
getting better every week. And you talk about November should be fun. There haven't been a lot of fun football Novembers around here
Right.
in our time in Colorado. So that alone, this has been a fun team to watch. The schedule sets up pretty well. Obviously, a big one right on the other side of the bye at Texas Tech. But after that, the schedule, it looked like it was going to be a tough stretch run at the beginning of the season. It hasn't worked out that way in the Big 12. And right now, that looks like a pretty favorable schedule down the stretch. Obviously, we'll get into the Texas Tech matchup a little bit more next week. But right now that looks like the toughest one of these last four games. And if they get that, who knows how, you might wind up making some pretty nice bowl plans later in December than just
Yeah.
kind of your run of the mill bowl.
Yeah, I mean, if they're 10-2, I mean, if things fall the right way, I don't put it out of the realm of possibility they're even in the college football playoffs. So a lot of things have to fall their way, but we'll see. But let's transition because typically in November, what we're doing is, and I think most Buff fans, when it gets to November, is typically they're like, "Is it basketball season yet?"
Yeah.
We're kind of done with this football team, but not the case this year. But basketball is going to be here, whether people are ready for it or not, because it starts as we're doing this on Thursday. Opening night is Monday night, November 4th, and you're going to be there. I'm going to be up in Laramie actually covering the women on Monday night, and so let's talk about some basketball and very interesting years coming up for these teams because uh, the programs to me, Pat, have been sort of on similar paths the last couple of years. Like last year, the men and women were both like very veteran teams that you had high expectations for. This year, they're very new teams that nobody has high expectations for outside of Boulder. So it's going to be an interesting basketball year.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because you also have two coaches that I don't think would prefer to build their teams through the transfer portal.
Right. Mhm.
Obviously, on the men's side, there's a few more possible rotation figures that have been around since they were freshmen, but still going to be leaning heavily on the three graduate transfers they brought in. Obviously, on the women's side, 10 total newcomers overall.
Mhm.
So it's been interesting to watch both these coaches, Tad Boyle and J.R. Payne, kind of adapt to the new reality in college basketball. But I agree with you. It's going to be a very interesting year. I've been crunching some numbers for a story I'll have over the weekend, but this is going to be by far, I'm talking on the men's side here, by far the least experienced team that Tad Boyle has had going into this is season 15 he's going into, by far the least experienced team he's had in terms of Division One games played, and even more so in starts like at that level. Now
Yeah.
you've got guys like Trevor Baskin who've played over 100 games at the Division Two level and a very decorated career there. Same with Elijah Malone at the NAIA level. It's not like these guys are completely green rookies. They've played a lot. They have not played any games at this level though. And in terms of Division One experience, the roster as it stands, even if you count well, you count Harrison Carrington, who was a walk on, but I'm going to count him, as a scholarship player here.
Yeah.
Um, they only have 206 games played on the roster at the Division One level. On the current roster, have played that many games at the Division One level. Most of that is, as you would guess, Julian Hammond's played 88 games,
Yeah.
Javon Ruffin's 42. So that's most of it right there. Sanjop and Bangat Dak played, it counts them, but they still are, you're talking about guys that played sparingly last year as freshmen. And on the roster, it's only 17 starts at the Division One level. Most of that is Julian Hammond with 15. Javon Ruffin had a couple starts a couple of years ago. The closest comparison would be the 17-18 team. That was the team that freshman class of Tyler Bay and McKinley Wright and Deshaun Schwartz. Evan Batty didn't play that year. He redshirted, but he was part of that group. But even that team had Dom Collier and George King, who were 3-year players, multiple year starters, and
Yeah.
guys like Tory Miller, who'd logged a lot of playing time. So even that team with a lot of inexperience wasn't as inexperienced as this one. And now they happen to be going into the toughest basketball conference in the country. That's why they were picked 15th in the coaches poll. I've written before, and I've said it on here. I don't think they'll finish 15th. I don't think they're an NCAA tournament team, but I think they'll finish better than 15th. There's some interesting pieces on this team. There will be plenty of growing pains along the way, but I don't think this is a 15th place team.
Yeah. And listening to you, and you mentioned all those numbers. It's like I thought the same thing. I'm like, oh, no wonder they're picked 15th in the Big 12.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's just the way these things work in the preseason. Is you and I have both voted in these things, and you kind of look at what a team's are coming back, what experience do they have, and if you're looking at a Colorado, you're seeing very little experience. You're going to throw them, near the bottom of that list, and so it's on Tad and that staff to get these guys to step up, and it's going to be interesting watching some of these guys that don't have that experience. Like a Trevor Baskin, he doesn't have D1 experience, but he's got a ton of college experience. How does that translate? There's going to be some interesting pieces there that I think, uh, as you mentioned, they're not a 15th place team. There's some interesting pieces that have to step up for them to not be that low in the standings.
Yeah, and to clarify, that CU games played. I was talking about Division
Right.
One games with CU, because one other person I failed to mention, I was mentioning Malone and Baskin. Obviously, Andre Yakimovsky played 4 years at Washington State. He's
Yeah.
played over 100 games, so that's another guy that certainly brings a measure of experience to the table. But it's gonna be a green team. They're gonna rely on a couple of those freshmen for minutes. They're gonna rely on RJ Smith, who was a rotation player out of the gate last year, got hurt early, had redshirted the previous
Mhm.
year, so he doesn't have a lot of experience. And the two sophomores I mentioned, Asanjope and Bangot Dak, they got in the mix a little bit. They kind of dipped their toes in last year, but neither of them were huge parts of that rotation for that NCAA tournament team last year. That's going to have to change this year, and they're obviously going to be counted on for a lot of production. We'll see what they do with the lineup, if those guys are starting or coming off the bench. But a lot of versatility on this team. I think that's going to be a strength of this team. I think if Hammond and Ruffin stay healthy, this is still going to be a pretty good 3-point shooting team.
Yeah.
That's always been kind of a benchmark of the team the last few years. I think it remains to be seen where the rebounds come from. Elijah Malone's going to have to come through in that department. Yakimovsky as well was a solid rebounder at Washington State. But I think that's a big question mark with this team. I think that again, going back to those, that's another place where maybe those sophomore forwards can step up and help out a bit in glass. Last year was a big rebounding by committee team. Eddie Lampkin led the way. I think he had 7 point something, maybe around 8 as a team leader. I
Right.
wouldn't expect the team leader to have more than that this year. Then you had guys like KJ and Tristan Da Silva, Cody Williams when he was in there, kind of in that 5 rebound mark. They're going to have that again this year. I don't think there's going to be one guy that's going to be among the Big 12 leaders in rebounding.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. It's gonna be interesting to see how that one plays out. We're talking about all these newcomers. You tell me if you agree or not, but I feel like one of the biggest keys for this team is Hammond and Ruffin. The two guys that have really been there and logged the most
Yeah.
minutes at CU, and whether they can stay healthy. And for both of them, they've been there a while now, and it's uh, we've kind of waited, and they've kind of waited to be the guys, right? And to prove themselves, and they've now had that opportunity. I feel like the two of them are as big of a key as anything. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting. I wrote a little bit about this last week while out at the Big 12 media days. Those two are the last guys left from the highest rated recruiting class in program history. Now, I
Yeah,
also mentioned in that article, obviously it's I think more appropriate to judge recruiting classes after the fact than before the fact.
yeah,
But still, that was the highest ranked class coming in. KJ Simpson obviously put it together last year, had, the kind of season you would hope for any recruit coming in. But after that, Lawson Lovering was the other high rated recruit in that class. 2 years, he showed promise his 1 year as a starter
mhm,
before he transferred to Utah. Quincy Allen never found traction at this level at all. He's going to be on his third team in as many years this year at Chicago State of all places. And that, leaves Hammond and Ruffin. Hammond's had his moments. He's been a rotation player since he's been here. Obviously, he's kind of played in the shadows of KJ Simpson and then had an injury shortened season last year.
yeah,
And same with Javon Ruffin. He had some moments 2 years ago, but as everyone knows, has been really limited by the knee issues during his time here. But I agree with you. If those guys stay healthy and both play 30 games or whatever, I think that's a pretty solid backcourt. Now they're not going to be the best duo in the Big 12, especially. But
yeah,
that's a couple of veteran guys in the backcourt. They're not going to get flustered. They're going to knock down an open three for you. They're going to move the ball into the right places. They know how the system works. And Hammond has an opportunity. There's been times where he's been a low turnover player in his time as
mhm,
well. So, I think that gives you a steady presence in that backcourt. They're not going to maybe be the most dynamic backcourt in the Big 12, but it's certainly not like they're going to be kind of working with a pair of rookies back there. And then I
yeah,
think RJ Smith kind of adds another element. Again, it's a guy that's been in the program a few years, hasn't played a lot of basketball, but he's athletic. He can get to the rim, can knock down an open shot. And again, if he can stay healthy, if those three guys who all had their seasons shortened for different reasons last year, Ruffins kind of started late while the other twos were cut short. But if those guys all have a full season, again, not the best backcourt in the Big 12, but I think that's three guys that will kind of get the job done and be able to hold things down back there and kind of give a veteran presence to the team.
Yeah, and I was thinking three of those guys from that recruiting class were at Big 12 Media Day because Lawson was there
Yeah.
representing
Yeah.
Utah. So, you have to give Tad and the staff credit. I mean, that class at least has shown they were talented, right? It was a pretty good class, and so now it's on some of those guys to really prove it this year. How about the schedule? We know it's a 20 game schedule in the Big 12. We know it's a brutal conference. There's five top 10 teams, I believe. But like with the women, and we can talk about this in a minute, but like J.R. Payne always talks about the non-conference schedule really setting you up and getting you ready for the Big 12. And I think this is more important than almost ever for the women's team. It feels like the same for the men. Would you agree? And is this a schedule that you think can get them ready, kind of get them battle tested?
Yes and no. They're going to have a great test in Maui. The home schedule,
Yeah,
let's face it, it's not that demanding for the Buffs. But the one
yeah,
thing Tad Boyle always talks about in terms of scheduling is scheduling for the team you think you're going to have.
yeah.
And in this case, to your point a little bit, they need to log some games together. They need to get battle tested
Yep.
a little bit together. They need to log minutes together. And, as far as the men's side, in terms of having a strong net ranking and any power ranking you want, the Big 12 is going to take care of that. I think in the Pac-12 there was years where you really wanted and in some years needed to have a couple quality non-conference games, especially when they're still playing an 18 game conference schedule.
Yeah.
That's not going to be the case in the Big 12. You're going to have a quality quad one, quad two game every night in that league. Like all 20 games are probably going to be like that. So you don't necessarily need a murderer's row in non-conference, or even you don't need to make sure you schedule a quad one in non-conference. Now that said, I think the schedule will do well for getting the team the minutes. They're not going to face none of those home games will give them kind of the competition at all that they will
Yeah.
face in the Big 12. I think it'll serve the purpose of getting them in the flow together, just getting them acclimated to one another. In terms of competition, they'll get that in Maui.
Yeah.
They'll open against Michigan State. They'll have three games in 3 days. All three should be pretty quality games. They'll play either Memphis or if the cards work out right, maybe I don't think the Buffs will be favored uh, against Michigan State. Memphis will not be favored against UConn, the two-time defending champs, but that's the alternate game there for the
Right.
Buffs, the winners match up and then the losers match up. And then they'll play someone on the other half of the bracket in the third game. And this is a field we got Auburn, Iowa State, North Carolina, and Dayton is out there as well. So they'll get some good competition there. It'll be 3 games in 3 days. It'll get them out of their comfort zone, and it won't exactly be raucous arena like they'll see in the Big 12. Certainly, maybe a few more distractions going to Maui, but
Yeah.
they'll get the competition aspect, I think, of the Big 12 and getting ready for the Big 12, that is, with those Maui dates the week of Thanksgiving.
Yeah, and I honestly think for a team like the men and the women, actually, that I think just getting games together is important. I know the home schedule for the men is not like, ooh, I can't wait to see that game. But I think those are important games because these players need minutes together, and same with the women. And I want to transition to the women, and then we can get season predictions for both those teams. But the women start at Wyoming, which is not going to be easy, but they've got an interesting schedule as well, and just a lot of opportunities to again log some minutes together. And like the men, there's not a lot of experience as buffs. There is more experience D1, but there's only 3 players on this team out of 14 that have played a game with the Buffs. Kendall Wetta wasn't even a starter, but she's a starter.
Yeah.
She only started twice so far in her career, but that's because Jalen Sherrod, Frida Foreman, Sarah Rose Smith, they're all back. They were key rotational players last year. Kennedy Sanders is back, but she redshirted last year. And then you have 10 newcomers, on this team. But it's guys like, or guys, it's girls like Leor Garzone, who was a starter at Oklahoma State, and Naimir Adu, who was a starter at Iowa State, and Jade Masagayo, who was a starter at Missouri State. So they've got experience. It's just they don't have it together.
Yeah, it seems like kind of the same deal on that side where they just got to log some minutes together.
Yeah,
And again, your backcourt, you feel pretty good about it. I know Frida kind of plays that wing and kind of we used to maybe call a small forward, the shooting guard.
right.
But Kindle obviously and Kennedy Sanders, as you wrote about a good piece this week about them kind of taking over that point guard role. Obviously, Wetta's been a part of that for a couple of years, but another group just has to log some games together. I think that's going to
Yeah.
be key for as key for the women's team as the men. They're going to get a few more battles. That game at Wyoming is not one to overlook right out of the gate. That's
Right.
never an easy trip going up there. And that'll be a nice test for that team right out of the gate.
Mhm. Yeah, and they've got one. They got their marquee one at home is Louisville, who could be a top
Yeah.
15 team coming into the season. We'll see where they are by the time they get here, end of November. But yeah, it's a schedule I think that sets up well for this team. It's a veteran team in a lot of ways, just not together. So I think there's some good pieces for this women's team. So how about projections? Where do you see the men finishing off this season? Like, are they a postseason team? Where do you see them?
I think this team. I'm going to say like NIT bubble range. That's hard to put a
Yeah.
record on anymore. I think in non-conference, I think they should win all those home games. Colorado State included. They're going to have a solid team coming in here. We, you know, Nick Clifford, I expect is going to have a huge year for them. But that home schedule, they should. I feel like they should win all those games. We'll see what happens in Maui. This team will still be pretty new when they have to take on Michigan State. But you know what?
Mhm.
Michigan State always gets off to, they're notorious slow starters themselves, and they always seem to have a few bad losses in November themselves. So let the chips fall where they may in that one and see, but I think if they can get one win in Maui, that's a great step forward.
Yeah.
And then as far as the Big 12, I still think they're going to surprise some teams at home. And some of those top five teams, I think it's three of them that they only have to play once. Like Houston, they don't go to Houston. They don't go to Baylor.
Mhm.
And the third one, let's see, Arizona. Arizona doesn't come to Boulder. So
Okay.
they get Kansas twice and they get Iowa State twice, and possibly a third time if things line up in Maui. Just
Right.
kind of way it works out. Those teams both signed up for it before the conference moves happened, but so that might help a little bit. It's not like they have to play all five of those teams twice. I think they can beat some of the other, kind of the next tier will be your Cincinnati, Texas Tech, maybe BYU going into this, Kansas State,
Mhm.
TCU. I think they can rise up and beat some of those teams at home. I think if they're in the 10 range in the, 12, 10, 12 in the Big 12, I still think that's a pretty good season for the Buffs for
Yeah.
as tough as this league is. It's a little subjective. There's a lot of state hype around. You look at the other Pac-12 holdovers. I still think they're better than Arizona State. Arizona State is always getting a little preseason hype, but they do a lot of years, and the Buffs wind up being better than them. And then Utah is the team that was picked 16th. I think the Buffs are better than them. And then Oklahoma State was the team picked 14th. I think the Buffs are better than them.
Mhm.
So I think there's wins to be had here and there. Again, I don't think this is an NCAA tournament team, but I think they'll surprise some people. I don't know that they'll get into the NIT. The Big 12 is tough, man. It's going to be tough to compete. It is going to be a bit of a transition year, I think, in the program while they turn the keys over, if you will, to kind of this year's freshmen and the class that they'll be signing here in another week. But I think this team, they have some interesting pieces. I think they'll get better as the year goes on.
Yeah.
And I think they can be in the mix for an NIT bid when we get to March.
Yeah, that's exactly where I see them as well. I don't see them NCAA tournament, but potentially, finishing in that 10 to 12 range and being NIT. I think NIT would be a great, season for, in a season like this with all the transition. I think that'd be a great season for the men. On the women's side, Pat, they're not going to be preseason top 25, I don't believe. They were picked ninth in the conference coming in. I think they're better than that. And J.R. Payne, she keeps telling me she loves this team. She thinks they're way better than people think. They're different. They don't have Jalen Sherrod and some of the pieces they had before, but they've got really good shooters, and we saw that Sunday against Mines. I think this is a team that they remind me of kind of Utah women the last couple of years, where they've got such good shooters, and if they're hitting, you're not going to beat them. But with a shooting team, if they're not hitting their shots, they're going to struggle. And I think that's what this team is going to do. I don't know if they're going to be as salty defensively, but I see them as an NCAA tournament bubble team. I think that if some things go well, I think they can play their way into the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, and you and I slightly disagree on this. I think the Big 12, it's not an easy conference. It's a tough conference, but I don't think it's what we've seen in the Pac-12 the last couple of years, where it's, kind of elite, multiple top 10, even top five teams.
Yeah,
The Buffs aren't going to have that quite this year. Take nothing away from the league. It's going to be a tough league. Obviously, there's tough teams in it as well. But I don't think it's going to be quite at what we've seen in the last couple of years in the Pac-12. And you mentioned it. There's some good Division One experience on this team. It's a question of how quickly they can come together, kind of how quickly they can get on the same page and play the kind of defense, especially that J.R. Payne expects and her staff expects. But I agree with you. I think this team can, I said the men maybe NIT bubble. I think the women's team has a chance to compete again for an NCAA tournament
yeah.
spot. I think they should be an NIT, WNIT team at the least. But I think, maybe kind of a notch above the men, kind of be in that bubble picture for the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's gonna be fun, and it starts on Monday. And Pat, before we get out of here, real quick, when's the men? The men are playing who again on Monday? I forgot.
Eastern Washington,
That's right, Eastern Washington on Monday at 7.
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock. All right. And the women are playing up in Laramie against Wyoming. So basketball gets started right around the corner. It's gonna be a lot of fun. And you and I are gonna have a busy, busy November because football is exciting and basketball is getting exciting or is getting started. But November is always our busiest month, whether football is good or not. So it's just gonna be crazier this month.
Yeah, every year. And another matchup, the in-state matchup for the Buffs men next week after the opener on Monday the 4th against Eastern Washington, and they come back on Friday the 8th against Northern Colorado.
Yeah.
So I
And
have
the
kind of
women play Northern Colorado on Thursday night, actually. So
okay.
yeah.
Okay. Cool. And real quick, before we're out of here, soccer staying alive. They got a real, best performance in over a month for the team. Obviously, I've written about it. If you follow, you've seen what's happened. It's just like the worst scoring drought you could ask for at the worst time of year
Yeah.
to end the regular season, kind of really fall out of the NCAA tournament picture. But they're still maybe on the bubble and they stayed alive. Great comeback win on Wednesday afternoon in the first round of the Big 12 tournament. A couple of just really skilled goals by Hope Leba and then by Ava Priest deep in the corner to give the Buffs a 2-1 win against Utah. Next up, Saturday afternoon, they get a rematch against TCU, who kind of really started the late slide. I feel like it
Right.
wasn't start of the winless streak per se, but TCU came in here with the Buffs riding high and got a 6-1 win, and really kind of put it to bed really early. TCU scored early and scored often at Prenup Field, and the game was over before you knew it. It was even over before halftime.
Yeah.
Um, but they'll get another shot at them on Saturday, rematch in Kansas City. Buffs kind of fighting for their lives, and we'll see you finally getting a couple goals under their belts. Maybe gets the confidence going. And then before we're out of here, volleyball's on the middle of a tough road trip, kind of on a slide themselves on a 4-game losing streak, going into a tough draw on Friday night at number 17 Baylor. It's been a little tough run on the road for the Buffs, and they have another tough one against another ranked pro on Friday night.
Yeah, we knew that was going to be kind of a bumpy ride for the volleyball team this year. But Pat, we're going to get out of here, and we'll chat next week again about the basketball openers, but also preview Texas Tech. And have a good weekend and enjoy that opener.
Yeah, best time of year for college sports, folks. So thanks for listening, and we'll do this again next week.